A Life of a Fool. By Ryunosuke Akutagawa. To Masao Kume. I want to leave to you the decision of whether to publish this manuscript, and if so, when and where. You probably know most of the people who appear in this manuscript. However, if it is published, I'd prefer it to be without an index. I'm now living in the most unhappy happiness. Yet strangely, I have no regrets. I only feel sorry for those who have me as their bad husband, bad son, and bad parent. Well, goodbye. In this manuscript, at least consciously, I tried not to defend myself. Finally, I'm entrusting this manuscript specifically to you because I believe you know me better than anyone else, if you peel away my urbanite exterior. Please laugh at my foolishness in this manuscript. June the 20th, 1927. Ryunosuke Akutagawa. 1. The Era. It was on the second floor of a bookstore. He, at 20, climbed a Western-style ladder attached to the bookshelf, searching for new books. Maupassant, Baudelaire, Strindberg, Ibsen, Shaw, Tolstoy, Twilight was approaching. But he kept reading the titles on the spines eagerly. What lined the shelves was not so much books as the fin de siècle itself. Nietzsche, Verlaine, the Goncourt brothers, Dostoevsky, Hauptmann, Flaubert, fighting against the growing darkness, he counted their names. But the books gradually sank into melancholy shadows. Finally running out of patience, he started to climb down the Western-style ladder. Just then, a bare electric light suddenly lit up right above his head. Standing still on the ladder, he looked down at the clerks and customers moving between the books. They looked strangely small. Moreover, they looked quite shabby. Life isn't worth even one line of Baudelaire. He stood on the ladder for a while, looking down at them with this thought, too. Mother. All the insane people wore the same mouse-colored clothes. The large room seemed even more depressing because of this. One of them sat at the organ, earnestly playing hymns. At the same time, another stood in the middle of the room, not so much dancing as jumping around. He watched this scene alongside a ruddy-faced doctor. His mother, too, had been no different from them 10 years ago. No different at all. He actually sensed his mother's scent in their odor. Shall we go? The doctor led the way down the corridor to a room. In the corner of that room, several brains were preserved in large glass jars filled with alcohol. He noticed something faintly white on one of the brains. It looked like a drop of egg white. While standing and talking with the doctor, he remembered his mother again. The man who owned this brain was an engineer at the XX Electric Company. He always thought he was a large, shiny dynamo. To avoid the doctor's eyes, he gazed out the glass window. There was nothing beyond the brick wall where broken bottles were planted except for pale patches of moss showing faintly. 3. Home. He lived in a room on the second floor of a house in the suburbs. It was a strangely tilted second floor due to the soft ground. His aunt often quarreled with him in this second-floor room. Sometimes these quarrels required mediation from his adoptive parents. Yet he felt more love for his aunt than anyone else. His aunt, who remained single all her life, was already nearly 60 when he was 20. In that tilted second-floor room in the suburbs, he often pondered why those who love each other must cause each other pain. All while sensing something unsettling in the tilt of the floor. 4. Tokyo. The Sumida River was heavily overcast. From the window of a small steamer, he watched the cherry trees on the opposite shore. The cherry trees in full bloom looked as melancholy as a line of rags to his eyes. Yet in those cherry trees that had been there since the Edo period, he somehow found himself. 5. Ego. He sat at a cafe table with his senior, constantly smoking cigarettes. He rarely spoke. But he listened intently to his senior's words. Today I spent half the day riding in a car. Did you have some business? His senior, resting his chin on his hand, answered very casually. No, I just wanted to ride. Those words liberated him into a world he didn't know, a world of the ego close to the gods. He felt some pain. But at the same time, he also felt joy. The cafe was very small. But under a picture of the god of bread, a rubber tree in a red pot drooped its thick leaves. 6. Illness. In the constant sea breeze, he opened a large English dictionary and searched for words with his fingertips. Talaria, winged shoes, or sandals. Tail, story. Talapart, a palm native to East India. The trunk reaches heights of 50 to 100 feet, and its leaves are used for umbrellas, fans, hats, etc. It blooms once every 70 years. His imagination clearly pictured this palm's flower. Then he felt an unfamiliar itch in his throat and unconsciously dropped spittle on the dictionary. Spittle? But it wasn't spittle. He thought of his short life and once again imagined this palm's flower. This palm flower towering high beyond the distant sea. 7. Art. It happened suddenly, truly suddenly. Standing at a bookstore's entrance, looking at a Van Gogh collection, he suddenly understood what art was. Of course, the Van Gogh collection was only photographic reproductions. But even in the reproductions, he felt nature vividly emerging. This passion for art renewed his field of vision. He found himself paying constant attention to the curves of tree branches and the fullness of women's cheeks. 1 Rainy autumn evening, he passed under a railway viaduct in the suburbs. A cart stood beneath the viaduct at the foot of the embankment. As he passed by, he sensed that someone had walked this road before. Who? He didn't need to ask himself. In the heart of the 23-year-old, a Dutch man with a cut-off ear sat holding a long pipe, staring intently at this melancholy landscape. 8. Sparks. He walked on the asphalt, soaked with rain. The rain was quite heavy. He smelled his rubber raincoat amidst the spray. Then, before his eyes, an overhead wire emitted a purple spark. He felt strangely moved. His coat pocket held his manuscript to be published in their literary magazine. While walking in the rain, he looked up again at the overhead wire behind him. The wire continued to emit sharp sparks. Looking at life, he didn't particularly want anything. But just these purple sparks, these fierce sparks in the sky, he wanted to capture them even if it cost him his life. 9. Corpse. All the corpses had tags attached to their thumbs with wire. These tags recorded names and ages. His friend bent over, skillfully moving his scalpel, and began to peel the skin from one corpse's face. Under the skin spread beautiful yellow fat. He watched the corpse. He needed this, no doubt, to complete a short story set in the Heian period. But the corpse's odor, similar to rotting apricots, was unpleasant. His friend frowned, quietly moving his scalpel. These days we're short on corpses. His friend said this. Then he found himself preparing an answer. When I'm short on corpses, I kill people without any malice. But of course, his answer remained only in his mind. 10. Teacher. He read his teacher's book under a large oak tree. The oak didn't move a single leaf in the autumn sunlight. A scale with a glass plate hanging somewhere in the distant sky, maintaining perfect balance. He felt such a scene while reading his teacher's book. 11. Dawn. Night gradually turned to dawn. He found himself looking over a wide marketplace at a street corner. The people and carts gathering in the market began to be tinged with rose color. He lit a cigarette and quietly walked into the market. Then a skinny black dog suddenly barked at him. But he wasn't startled. Moreover, he even loved that in the middle of the market stood a plane tree, spreading its branches in all directions. He stood at its base and looked up at the high sky through the branches. One star shone directly above him. This was in his 25th year, 3 months after meeting his teacher. 12. Naval port. Inside the submarine was dim. He bent down among the machines surrounding him on all sides and peered through a small periscope. In that periscope was reflected the bright scenery of the naval port. You can see the Kongu over there, can't you? A naval officer spoke to him like this. While watching the small warship on the square lens, he somehow suddenly remembered Dutch parsley. The Dutch parsley that faintly scented the 30-cent beef steak. 13. The teacher's death. He walked on a new station platform in the wind after rain. The sky was still dim. Beyond the platform, 3 or 4 railway workers were swinging pickaxes in unison, singing something in loud voices. The after-rain wind tore apart the worker's song and his emotions. He felt a pain close to joy, not even lighting his cigarette. The telegram reading teacher critical remained stuffed in his coat pocket. Then from behind the pine-covered hill, the 6 a.m. uptrain appeared, trailing thin smoke, winding its way closer. 14. Marriage. The day after his marriage, he scolded his wife, saying we can't be wasteful with money so soon. But this scolding came more from his aunts tell her than from himself. His wife apologized not only to him but also to his aunt, in front of the pot of yellow daffodils she had bought for him. 15. They. They lived peacefully, in the shade of large banana leaves spreading wide because their house was in a coastal town an hour by train from Tokyo. 16. Pillow. He read Anatole France's book while using skepticism that smelled of rose petals as his pillow. But he never noticed that within that pillow lived a centaur. 17. Butterfly. A butterfly fluttered in the wind filled with the scent of seaweed. For just a moment, he felt the butterfly's wing touch his dry lips. But the wing powder that had been pressed onto his lips still sparkled even years later. 18. Moon. He accidentally encountered her on the stairs of a hotel. Her face seemed to be in moonlight even in such daylight. While watching her leave, they were complete strangers. He felt a loneliness he had never known before. 19. Artificial wings. From Anatole France, he moved on to 18th-century philosophers. But he didn't approach Rousseau. Perhaps because one side of himself, the side easily driven by passion, was close to Rousseau. He approached the philosopher of Candide, who was closer to his other side, the side rich in cold reason. Life was no longer bright at all to him at 29. But Voltaire supplied him with artificial wings. He spread these artificial wings and easily soared into the sky. At the same time, life's joys and sorrows bathed in the light of reason sank beneath his eyes. He dropped irony and smiles over shabby towns as he flew straight up toward the sun through unobstructed sky. Just like that ancient Greek who forgot how such artificial wings, burned by sunlight, led to his death in the sea. 20. Shackles. He and his wife came to live with his adoptive parents. This was because he had gotten a job at a newspaper. He relied on a contract written on yellow paper. But looking back later, the contract turned out to be one where only he had obligations while the newspaper company had none. 21. The Madwoman's Daughter. Two rickshaws ran along a deserted country road under cloudy skies. The road clearly led to the sea, as evident from the sea breeze. Riding in the rear rickshaw, he wondered why he had no interest in this rendezvous, trying to understand what had led him here. It wasn't love. If not love, then to avoid answering this, he had to think at any rate, we are equals. The person riding in the front rickshaw was a madwoman's daughter. Moreover, her sister had committed suicide out of jealousy. There's nothing to be done now. He already felt a certain hatred for this madwoman's daughter for her strong animal instincts. The two rickshaws passed by a fishy-smelling cemetery. Behind the brush fence covered with oyster shells, several stone monuments stood darkened. Looking at the faintly gleaming sea beyond those monuments, he suddenly began to despise her husband who didn't capture her heart. 22. A certain artist. It was an illustration in a magazine. But the ink drawing of a rooster showed remarkable individuality. He asked a friend about this artist. About a week later, this artist visited him. It was one of the most significant events in his life. He discovered in this artist a poetry unknown to others. Moreover, he discovered his own soul that he hadn't known himself. On a chilly autumn evening, he suddenly remembered this artist while looking at a single sorghum stalk. The tall sorghum exposed its roots like thin nerves on the mounded earth, its rough leaves withered. This was undoubtedly also a self-portrait of his vulnerable self. However, such discoveries only made him depressed. It's too late. But when the time comes. 23. She. It was getting dark in front of a certain plaza. He walked across this plaza with a slightly feverish body. Several large buildings faintly sparkled their window lights in the silver-clear sky. He stopped at the roadside, deciding to wait for her arrival. After about 5 minutes, she walked toward him, looking somewhat haggard. But seeing his face, she smiled, saying, "I'm tired." They walked across the dimly lit plaza side by side. This was their first time. He felt he could give up anything just to be with her. After they got in their car, she stared at his face and asked, "Won't you regret this?" He answered firmly, "I won't regret it." She pressed his hand and said, "I won't regret it either." Her face seemed to be in moonlight even at such times. 24. Birth. He stood by the sliding door, looking down at a midwife in white surgical clothes washing a newborn baby. The baby made pitiful grimaces each time the soap stung its eyes. Moreover, it kept crying in a high voice. While sensing an odor from the baby similar to that of a baby mouse, he couldn't help thinking deeply, why was this one born too? Into this world full of suffering. Why was this one also destined to have someone like me as a father? Yet this was his wife's firstborn son. 25. Strindberg. He stood at the doorway of the room, watching some shabby Chinese men playing mahjong in the moonlight where pomegranate flowers bloomed. Then returning to the room, he began reading A Madman's Defense under the low lamp. But before reading 2 pages, he found himself smirking. Strindberg too wrote similar lies in his letters to the Countess who was his lover. 26. Ancient times. The Buddhas, celestial beings, horses, and lotus flowers with their colors peeling nearly overwhelmed him. Looking up at them, he forgot everything. Even his own good fortune in escaping from the madwoman's daughter. 27. Spartan training. He was walking through a back street with his friend. Then a rickshaw with its hood up approached directly from the opposite direction. Moreover, surprisingly, riding in it was she from last night. Her face seemed to be in moonlight even in such daylight. They naturally didn't even exchange greetings in front of his friend. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" His friend said this. Looking at the spring mountain at the end of the street, he answered without any hesitation. "Yes, she's quite beautiful." 28. Murder. The country road wafted the smell of cow dung in the sunlight. Wiping his sweat, he climbed the uphill path. The ripened wheat on both sides of the road released a fragrant scent. "Kill, kill." He found himself repeating these words in his mouth. Who? That was clear to him. He was thinking of a seemingly servile man with a crew cut. Then beyond the yellowed wheat, the dome of a Roman Catholic church suddenly appeared. 29. Form. It was an iron teapot. He had somehow learned the beauty of form from this teapot with its cast seams. 30. Rain. He was talking with her about various things on a large bed. Outside the bedroom window, it was raining. The beach lily flowers seemed to be rotting in this rain. Her face, as always, seemed to be in moonlight. But talking with her wasn't without boredom for him. Lying on his stomach, he quietly lit a cigarette and remembered that it had been 7 years since they started living together. Do I love this woman? He asked himself this question. The answer surprised even himself who had been watching himself. I still love her. 31. The Great Earthquake. It was something close to the smell of overripe apricots. Walking through the burned ruins, he faintly sensed this smell and thought that even the smell of corpses rotting in the scorching sun wasn't particularly bad. But standing before a pool where corpses were piled up, he discovered that the word horrific was certainly no exaggeration even sensually. What especially moved him was the corpse of a 12 or 13-year-old child. Looking at this corpse, he felt something close to envy. Those whom the gods love die young. He remembered such words. Both his sister and half-brother had their houses burned. However, his sister's husband was on probation for perjury. It would be better if everyone died. Standing in the ruins, he couldn't help thinking this deeply. 32. Fight. He got into a physical fight with his half-brother. His brother was likely to be easily oppressed because of him. At the same time, he too was undoubtedly losing his freedom because of his brother. His relatives kept telling his brother to get used to him. But for him, this was like being tied hand and foot. They grappled and finally rolled onto the veranda. In the garden off the veranda stood a crepe myrtle he still remembers raising its crimson flowers under a rain-threatening sky. 33. Hero. From the window of Voltaire's house, he was looking up at a high mountain. Not even a vulture's shadow could be seen above the glacier-covered mountain. But a short Russian man persistently continued climbing the mountain path after Voltaire's house grew dark. He wrote this kind of tendentious poem under the bright lamp, remembering the figure of that Russian climbing that mountain path. You who kept the 10 Commandments more than anyone. Are you who broke them more than anyone? You who loved the masses more than anyone? Are you who despised them more than anyone? You who burned with ideals more than anyone? Are you who knew reality more than anyone? You are the electric locomotive that our Orient produced. Fragrant with flowers. 34. Color. At 30, he had somehow come to love a certain vacant lot. There was nothing there but brick and tile fragments scattered on moss-covered ground. But to his eyes, it was no different from a Cézanne landscape. He suddenly remembered his passion from 7 or 8 years ago. At the same time, he discovered that 7 or 8 years ago, He hadn't known color. 35. Puppet. He intended to live intensely so he would have no regrets when he died. But he continued living cautiously as ever, mindful of his adoptive parents and aunt. This created light and dark sides to his life. Seeing a puppet standing in a tailor shop window, he considered how much he himself resembled a puppet. But his unconscious self, his second self, so to speak, had already incorporated such feelings into a short story. 36. Weariness. He was walking through a pampas grass field with a university student. You young people still have a strong desire to live, don't you? Yes, but even you. Actually, I don't have it. Although I still have the desire to create. That was his true feeling. He had indeed lost interest in life without realizing it. Isn't the desire to create also a desire to live? He didn't answer. The pampas grass field gradually revealed a volcanic mountain above its red plumes. He felt something close to envy for this volcanic mountain. But even he didn't know why. 37. Passing stranger. He encountered a woman who could match him in intellectual power. But he escaped this crisis by writing lyrical poems like Passing Stranger. It felt like shaking snow off a tree branch, something painfully touching. The wind may scatter a sedge hat. Why should it not fall on the road? Why should I care for my own name? I care only for your name. 38. Revenge. It was on a terrace of a hotel amid budding trees. He drew pictures there while entertaining a boy, the only son of the madwoman's daughter he had broken ties with 7 years ago. The madwoman's daughter lit a cigarette and watched them play. He continued drawing trains and airplanes with a heavy heart. Fortunately, the boy wasn't his child. But it pained him most when the boy called him uncle. After the boy went somewhere, the madwoman's daughter spoke to him seductively while smoking. Doesn't that child look like you? No, he doesn't. First of all. But there's such a thing as prenatal influence, isn't there? He silently looked away. Yet deep in his heart, he couldn't deny having a cruel desire to strangle this woman. 39. Mirror. He sat talking with his friend in a corner of a cafe. His friend ate baked apples and talked about the recent cold weather. He suddenly felt contradictions in such conversation. You were still single, weren't you? No, I'm getting married next month. He fell silent involuntarily. The mirror set in the cafe wall reflected countless images of himself. Coldly, as if threatening. 40. Dialogue. Why do you attack the current social system? Because I see the evil born of capitalism. Evil? I thought you didn't recognize the difference between good and evil. Then what about your way of life? He had this dialogue with an angel. Though admittedly, an angel wearing a top hat that no one would be ashamed of. 41. Illness. He began suffering from insomnia. Moreover, his physical strength started to decline. Several doctors gave various diagnoses for his illness: hyperacidity, gastric atony, dry pleurisy, neurasthenia, chronic conjunctivitis, brain fatigue. However, he himself knew the source of his illness. It was the feeling of being ashamed of himself while fearing them. The society he despised. One snowy, cloudy afternoon, he sat in a corner of a cafe with a lit cigar, listening to music flowing from the gramophone across the room. It was music that strangely penetrated his mood. He waited for the music to end and walked to the gramophone to check the record's label: Magic Flute Mozart. He understood instantly. Mozart, who broke the 10 Commandments, must have suffered too. But surely not like him. He lowered his head and quietly returned to his table. 42. The laughter of the gods. At 35, he walked through a pine forest bathed in spring sunlight, remembering words he himself had written 2 or 3 years ago. Unfortunately, the gods cannot commit suicide like us. 43. Night. Night approached once again. The stormy sea kept throwing up spray in the twilight. Under such skies, he married his wife for the second time. It was joy for them. But it was also pain. Their 3 children watched the offshore lightning with them. His wife held one child, seemingly holding back tears. Can you see a ship over there? Yes. A ship with its mast broken in 2. 44. Death. Taking advantage of sleeping alone, he tried to hang himself from the window bars with his sash. But when he put his neck in the noose, he suddenly became afraid of death. It wasn't because he feared the pain of dying. He decided to try hanging himself a second time, holding his pocket watch to test it. After a brief pain, everything began to grow dim. If he passed that point, he would certainly enter death. He checked his watch and discovered that his suffering had lasted only 1 minute and 20-some seconds. Outside the window bars was pitch dark. But in that darkness, there was also the harsh cry of a rooster. 45. Divan. The divan tried once more to give new strength to his heart. It was the Oriental Gertie he hadn't known. He saw Gertie standing serenely beyond all good and evil, and felt an envy close to despair. To his eyes, the poet Gertie was greater than the poet Christ. In this poet's heart bloomed not only the Acropolis and Golgotha but also Arabian roses. If only he had some strength to follow in this poet's footsteps after finishing the divan, and when the terrible emotion had calmed, he couldn't help despising himself, born a spiritual eunuch. 46. Lies. His sister's husband's suicide suddenly knocked him down. Now he had to take care of his sister's family too. His future, at least to him, was as dim as dusk. While feeling something close to mockery at his spiritual bankruptcy, he knew all his vices and weaknesses. He continued reading various books as usual. But even Rousseau's Confessions was full of heroic lies. Especially Vita Nuova, he had never met such a crafty hypocrite as its protagonist. But François Villon alone penetrated his heart. He discovered beautiful honesty in several poems. The image of Villon awaiting execution appeared even in his dreams. He tried many times to fall to the bottom of life like Villon. But his circumstances and physical energy wouldn't allow such things. He gradually weakened. Just like the tree Swift saw long ago, withering from its top branches. 47. Playing with fire. Her face was radiant. It was like morning sunlight shining on thin ice. He felt goodwill toward her. But he didn't feel love. Moreover, he hadn't touched even a finger to her body. I hear you want to die. Yes, no, rather than wanting to die, I'm tired of living. From such exchanges, they promised to die together. A platonic suicide, isn't it? A double platonic suicide. He couldn't help finding his own calmness strange. 48. Death. He didn't die with her. Just never having touched her body gave him some satisfaction. She occasionally talked with him as if nothing had happened. Moreover, she gave him a vial of potassium cyanide she had, saying, having this should make us both stronger. It indeed seemed to strengthen his heart. Sitting alone in a rattan chair, watching young oak leaves, he often couldn't help thinking about the peace death would give him. 49. Stuffed swan. He tried to use his last strength to write his autobiography. But it turned out unexpectedly difficult for him. This was because his self-esteem, skepticism, and calculated self-interest still remained. He couldn't help despising such aspects of himself. But on the other hand, he couldn't help thinking everyone's the same if you peel away one layer. The title Poetry and Truth seemed to him like a title fitting for any autobiography. Moreover, he clearly understood that not everyone is moved by literary works. His works could only appeal to people who lived lives similar to his own. Such thoughts worked in him too. For this reason, he decided to try writing his poetry and truth briefly. After completing A Life of a Fool, he happened to find a stuffed swan in an antique shop. Though it stood with its neck raised, even its yellowed feathers were eaten by insects. He thought of his life and felt tears and cold laughter welling up. All that remained before him was either madness or suicide. Walking alone on the evening streets, he resolved to wait quietly for the fate coming to destroy him. 50. Captive. One of his friends went insane. He had always felt a certain closeness to this friend. This was because he deeply understood this friend's solitude, the solitude beneath the light-hearted mask more than most. After his friend went insane, he visited him 2 or 3 times. You and I are possessed by evil spirits. By the fin de siècle evil spirit, you know. His friend told him such things in a hushed voice, but then a few days later, it was said he ate even rose flowers while on his way to a hot spring inn. After his friend was hospitalized, he remembered the terracotta bust he had once given to this friend. It was a bust of the author of The Government Inspector, whom his friend had loved. Thinking how Gogol too had died insane, He couldn't help feeling some force controlling them. Completely exhausted, he happened to read Radiguet's dying words and once again felt the laughter of the gods. The words were, "God's soldiers are coming to catch me." He tried to fight against his superstition and his sentimentalism. But any kind of fight was physically impossible for him. The fin de siècle evil spirit was indeed tormenting him. He felt envy for medieval people who found strength in God. But believing in God's love was utterly impossible for him. The God that even Cocteau believed in. 51. Defeat. His hand trembled even when holding a pen. Moreover, he began drooling. His head was never clear except for after taking 0.8 grams of veronal. Even then, it was clear for only half an hour or an hour. He just lived his day-to-day life in dimness. So to speak, using a thin sword with a chipped blade as his cane. June 1927, posthumous manuscript.